Good morning and welcome to week 19 of our reading of the Bible in a year. We are concluding the book of 2nd Kings this week and starting into the book of 1st Chronicles. And that's really it'll be a little bit of a divided week for you as you read through this, because after you finish 2nd Kings, there's a little bit of a reset. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But as we finish up 2nd Kings, um, we have just come through the end of last week reading about the destruction of the northern kingdom. The Assyrians came in and took over the northern kingdom. So there's a lot of fear going on in the southern kingdom of Judah because the Assyrians are just decimating everyone. They are taking over the entire region, and they're pretty ruthless about it. And so we get into Second Kings, uh, chapter 19, and word comes to Hezekiah, king of Judah, that Sennacherib and the Assyrians are closing in, and he is terrified. And so he offers up a prayer in chapter 19 to God, asking for God's protection. But it's really interesting and I think very important to understand why God does what he does in light of where Hezekiah's heart is. Hezekiah is not just praying for sparing of the city because he's the king and it looks bad for him if something were to happen, and because he wants Israel to be, or Judah to be established, and it's all about them as a nation. He concludes his prayer by saying, stand in the way of this, give us victory, so that the people may know that you alone are God. There's all these other nations that have been taken over. Their gods, their false idols have been destroyed. And so Hezekiah is pleading with God that he would not allow the same thing to happen to his name as is happening to the name of all the other false gods, so that God would be the God of Judah, of the Israelites, would be established as the one and only true God. And God answers. It's actually an amazing account. Hezekiah doesn't lift a finger. In the middle of the night, God sends the angel of the Lord over the armies of Sennacherib, and 185,000 in the military of Sennacherib are put to death in one night. And Sennacherib slinks away, ultimately to be killed by his sons and for them to succeed him. And so Hezekiah praises God, and the nation of Judah continues. Succeeding him is Josiah. Rare occurrence, we get two good kings in a row. Josiah is quite young. He's 8 when he finds himself as king, and so obviously needs some good advisors and receives it. Grows up as king, and when he's 26, 18 years into his reign, he sends messengers to search the temple, and they find the book of the law, which seems to have been lost for some time. And when Josiah reads it, he is devastated because they are not living up to their end of the covenant. And so he tears his clothes and repents and calls for all people to do the same. And he renews the covenant. He goes back to the covenant promises that God had made and says, this is what we're going to do. And so Josiah, following Hezekiah, is a positive example of a king in Israel. After Josiah dies, it just goes all downhill. The next kings, each of them, it says they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they lead them into idolatry. And so at the end of the next 4 kings, in chapter 25, we get the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is coming not by the Assyrians, but the Babylonians have been raised up. They have taken over the Assyrians, and now they come in and take over the southern kingdom of Judah. But at the end of 2nd Kings, we get this little account. It says it's 37 years into the exile. So the city is taken over, and all of a sudden there's this jump 37 years into the future. And it says that in that year, Jehoiachin is released from prison. Jehoiachin is one of the descendants of David that was taken into exile, and the kingly line is therefore preserved. And he finds favor in the king of the Babylonians at the time, and there's this little glimpse of hope that the Davidic line has not been destroyed, despite all the evil that has happened. in both the southern and northern kingdom, that God is faithful to his promise, and there's this glimpse that something good is going to come from it. And that's where 2 Kings ends. And you think, well, now we're going to get into the fulfillment of hope. But nope. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a reset. 1st and 2nd Chronicles goes back to the beginning of the reign, really, of Saul, but Saul is treated very briefly in here, and gets to the line of David. The entire focus of the books of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, is on the faithfulness of God through the Davidic line and God being faithful to his promises. So what you're reading here this week in chapters 1 through 12, 1 through 9, it's going to be a little bit of a strain because it's genealogies, a lot of genealogies. But they are important because they serve to establish the line of King David, also the line of King Saul, so we can see that his kingship is still valid, even though it's not a focus in the Chronicles, but also to connect the line of David all the way back to the promises of God. It goes back to the time of Adam and Eve, goes back to Moses, and establishes these promises that God made. And now we're to see in 1st and 2nd Chronicles the fulfillment of those, at least an initial fulfillment, in the line of King David. The genealogies through chapter 9. Chapter 10, you get Saul's reign, but all it is his death. It doesn't really go into a lot of the details of it, simply to be a place marker, a transition to get to the reign of David, which is established in chapters 11 and 12 with demonstrations of mighty power and mighty men coming alongside to fight along with him and to help establish the rule of King David. We'll talk a little bit more about how idealized this picture is when we look at next week, when we get more into it. But sufficient for today is the knowledge that 1st Chronicles is a reset going back to the beginning of the period of the kings. And it is a book that looks at the reign of King David and Solomon and those that follow after as pointing forward to the Messiah King who was to come. God's blessings on your reading this week. Pray that, that though it's a little bit divided, that it'll be a blessing to you as you continue to see the hand of God at work amongst his people.